Alrighty, everyone. I think it's time for us to get started. As I said, hello, my name is Sage Dennis, and I'm an organic consultant at the Rodale Institute. And today I'm going to be speaking with you about how to create an organic fertility program using soil testing. Now, to be clear, that's only one tool in our tool belt because we're going to be using quite a few today, but it is by far going to be the driving force behind our discussions. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Just please make sure that you're muted. If you do happen to have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button. Do not put those messages in chat. I do get distracted easily. And before we jump into it, I wanted to give you a little bit about background about myself. I have been in organic consulting for about 7 years. I have been with Rodale for about 6 months. Prior to this, I was an organic agronomist with a company by the name of the Fertile Company, and they are an organic fertilizer and animal supplement company based out of South Central Pennsylvania. And they had kind of laid the foundation, if you will, for the topics at hand today. I was able to take what I learned there, as well as all of the opportunities in education that I've received at Rodale to create this presentation for you. But before we get into soil testing, I'm going to talk to you about something I'm sure you already know, which is the 3 aspects of your soil, or the 3 characteristics of your soil: physical, biological, and chemical. Physical is obvious. It's your aggregate size, your tilth. Biological is everything from the bacteria to the earthworms and how they are able to envelop your soil's health through all the processes that go on underneath the soil that we just try to encourage with a lot of these organic and sustainable farming practices. And then lastly is the chemical aspect, which is going to be your minerals, your nutrients, your overall fertility, as well as your pH. And one thing that I do want to point out while we're here is that in organic farming or sustainable farming, generally we prioritize the biological and the physical aspects more so than the chemical, whereas in traditional or conventional agriculture, it seems to be a little bit of juxtaposition, and the chemical is definitely leaned on much more heavily, especially when we're speaking about fertility. And I'll get to the reasons behind that throughout this presentation. Step 1 of this 4-step program, if you will, is very easy. And if you're a farmer at home, feel free to fill out your own information and try to do the math along the way. Just get to understand the farmer. So this is just a metaphorical farmer that I'm speaking with. He's a row crop farmer, and he's shooting for 175 bushels per acre of corn, 3% organic soil matter, and he does traditional tillage. He will do 1 heavy moldboard plow to bury the weed seeds in the spring of the year, and then after that, he will conservatively disc or do light tillage as needed. He planted soybeans last year and harvested at 40 bushels an acre, and he applied manure last year at a rate of 1 ton to the acre, and that is still available for this growing season moving forward, which we'll be talking about later when we actually are looking at our soil test recommendation. But that manure he applied last year was dissed in within 24 hours of application, followed by a 50-50 application of rye and crimson clover. Before we even get into the soil test yet, I want to make sure we all know what's available and what we can take advantage of, because a lot of this information is just going to give us a small piece of that picture that we're going to need to be able to make a concise recommendation. So before the season even starts, you have your soil testing, which is what we're going to be predominantly looking at today. It's going to give you the chemical portfolio of your soil. There's the Cornell assessment of soil health, which focuses on the physical characteristics. Of course, manure and compost testing, whether you are sourcing that on farm or off your farm, I always recommend that you get a manure compost test so we know the true availability of what it is we are going to be applying. And then seed selection, which is obvious for many of you, especially when it comes to your cash crops. We typically get we get a variety that is resistant to disease, environmental stresses, is able to produce. But I actually encourage individuals to go one step further, especially when we're looking at cover crops, and that is to just look into the carbon to nitrogen ratio of your crop, because it'll give us an idea of how long those crops will take to break down in your soil. Also on top of that is taking a few additional steps with said cover crop if you happen to go that route, which I do heavily encourage everyone to look at seriously considering a cover crop. And 2 of the strongest reasons is, 1, we can do a forage test, and a forage test will show us the crude protein percent in a cover crop. And for every 6.25% nitrogen, you're given 1% inorganic nitrogen analysis. And that's pretty substantial when you start getting into larger amounts of biomass, especially for an organic farmer, because inorganic forms of nitrogen aren't the easiest for us to come by. But on top of that, there's a lot of research out there from various universities or outlets such as PSU, OSU, Cornell, and SARE that will give you an approximation of the total amount of nitrogen that you could expect based on the application rate for your various cover crops. In season, though, I encourage people to take it a step further, and there are crop biomass calculators out there. The NRCS is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful resource for this type of calculation, as they have very digestible and comprehensive information to help you make that decision. And then also past that, for your more higher dollar value crops, there's tissue testing. If you do grow a higher dollar value crop, I encourage you to tissue test 4 weeks or a month before flowering, and then I encourage you to do so every couple of weeks throughout the season since then, because that will make sure you have your baseline before your fruits start setting and you start getting this huge amount of nutrient demand from your plant. So you're able to kind of reference back to that initial tissue test once you are in the heat of harvesting. So now that we know everything that's out there, we're going to talk about taking a soil test. When you're taking a soil test, you don't need much. It's really simple. You just need a bucket, a shovel, and some gloves, and eventually a bag. And what you're going to want to do is we're going to want to find a plot. Just imagine a 1x1 square. You're going to find a plot. If it has any amount of excess debris, kick it off with your boot. If there's a lot, grab a rake, clear it off. And debris could be corn stover, could be other root material, could be manure patty, anything that is carbon that will be breaking down. Let's try to clear off of that soil surface, because that will help create a more accurate representation of our nutrient portfolio. Once we found our spot, I tell people to dig a V or a football out of the soil and set it to the side. And then from that V, you're going to take a slice, whichever one, left or right, pick your poison. You're going to throw it into a bucket, and then you're going to repeat that probably 2, 3, 4 more times. And we'll get into that designation in a moment. But once you have all of your plots or all of your samples for your designated plot in the bucket, you're going to give it a good shake, mix it around with your hand that has that glove on it, because the oils in your hand can alter your test results. And then you're just going to fill up a sandwich bag's worth, or a lot of testing facilities will send you out a bag, or if you are working with any third-party consultant, I'm sure that they have some type of mailing material for you as well. But once you have it in the bag, make sure, well, before we do that, make sure that it isn't mud. First and foremost, your researchers will like you for that, or the people that are running the tests will thank you. And even if you do send it, there is a limitation to the amount of moisture that a sample is allowed to have. So you may be waiting a few days for that sample to dry out. But once these samples are taken, we need to talk about when is the best time, or if you're going to take samples, when is the best time. And really, it's going to be any time. Let me move that up there for you. The best time is going to be whenever you can. But whenever you can, as long as the soil temperatures are above 50 degrees, is even better. It gives you a little bit more accurate phosphorus reading. And generally for us organic farmers, you don't get the microbial activity until that 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So even if you were to take a test and then were to follow it up with an application, if you aren't at those temperatures yet, you're not going to get that product breakdown. And then to go back to the plot size designation, I tell people that as long as the crop is going to be the same, the layout is the same, and the soil structure is the same, really that can all be one sample. So if you have 50 acres of flat land with no swales or anything like that, that is all one sample. You could also do a market garden situation where if you have 15 different raised beds, I don't want you to send in 15 samples. Instead, sample small amounts from each area, or take a random sampling from various beds, incorporate all of them together and send that in as one sample. And then when you're getting into the actual recommendation, make the recommendation based on the most demanding crop that you are going to be growing. While we are looking at how to interpret a soil test, there's a few things that we need to take into consideration. One of them is the mindset of balancing everything within reason. And the reason I think this is such an effective way of managing organic soil fertility is because that is our whole perspective. We encourage our soils to be as plentiful as possible. So when we plant a crop and we nurture it to grow, whatever it will need is already in the soil for it. So it's best for us to have everything as available and as balanced as possible. And to put it into perspective, I want you to imagine it this way. Every single nutrient that you have in your soil is a plank as you build a barrel, this metaphorical barrel. You start putting them around, and as you do so, and you have your barrel finished up, you start pouring in your water, and that water is your yield. Well, your yield, or the water, will start pouring out, or your yield will stop, or your yield will cap, I should say, once that water starts pouring over. And that happens at the smallest plank. The smallest plank is your nutrient that is least available. You could have 1,000,000 pounds of nitrogen, but if you have no sulfur in your soil, you're not going to get proper nitrogen utilization. That's the concept of Liebig's barrel. Also, I want it to be understood that this ratio is important because there are synergies and antagonisms within the soil, and that is Mulder's chart up there in the top right, and that is a keystone to how soil fertility and organic operations needs to be approached. It's a whole measure twice, cut once mentality with a lot of these nutrients because we can easily incorporate them, but sometimes we can't necessarily remove them very easy. So understanding these relationships, as well as looking at these base saturations and or these parameters that I have on the left side here, are going to help ensure that you don't throw anything too out of whack. Before we start talking about pH, I want to address these numbers here. Macronutrients, as it says, it's a case-by-case basis because that all comes down to the nutrient holding capability of your soils. I'm going to treat a sandy soil that has low nutrient holding capability much differently in terms of the overall fertility. I'm trying to have source to it than I will a clay soil. So I found that creating or trying to create macronutrient parameters, I guess with the exception of phosphorus, are a little tricky, whereas base saturation is much more easy to digest because it gives you those ratios or that understanding of that innate balance in your soil that we're trying to achieve. 65 to 75% calcium, 10 to 15% magnesium, 3 to 6% potassium, 1-ish% sodium, and then hydrogen is part of the base saturation, but I have no ideal range for it. And the reason for some of these numbers is essentially because calcium and magnesium, I need them to both be available, but there's a ratio or a balance there, and that tends to settle within these percentages. With your potassium, it does matter a little bit what you are wanting to grow. If you have a pasture or you're focusing on leafy greens, your potassium needs are going to be much, much less than someone that is in a intensive, high fruiting vegetable operation. In a situation like that, I'm going to encourage you to get that 6%, probably even a little bit more. Whereas your sodium is something that I seldomly see it high. There's a little bit of salt in a lot of the inputs that we use, and there's a considerable amount of sodium in some of the inputs we use, such as sodium nitrate, for instance. So it's rare to see sodium levels be a limiting or a damaging factor in organic operations when used responsibly. That is something that I typically will run to. The sodium, that is something that I typically run to when I look at transitioning farmers, since sodium is a much more common carrier of various products in a conventional agricultural operation. And then lastly, for hydrogen, I want everyone to imagine a cup full of water, kind of like this. And as I drink it, like I have, and that cup starts to fill with air where that water once was, That air is the hydrogen. It's simply a filler or a measurement of the acidity. Once you get to a neutral or alkaline soil, that hydrogen will always be 0. And some crops do fine in situations like that, or you're growing in an environment where you will always have alkaline soils, such as like an arid desert out west. Yet if you are growing blueberries, for instance, you could see that jump up 10, 20+%, and that's absolutely fine. I don't let hydrogen designate much, but I use it as a way to better understand the acidity of the soil. And then finally, when we look at these micronutrient values, I used to have more set limitations to the actual nutrient thresholds. However, I've kind of taken a step back from that, and I have a baseline fertility instead. Pardon me. And the reason for that is because with some of these micronutrients, such as zinc, manganese, iron, and copper, that are heavy metals, sometimes, depending on the structure of your soil, they can be very high. So high, in fact, that it's unrealistic to try and get 12 to 25 parts per million of iron. And so I feel like we're setting ourselves up for failure because we're trying to change the structure of our soil, which is not something we're able to do. In a situation like that, what I always encourage a grower to do is to take that tissue test, because that tissue test is going to show us not what is completely available, like what a soil test will do, but rather how your plant or the degree that the plant is uptaking a particular nutrient. If you have 300 parts per million of iron in your soil, but your plants are only utilizing the iron that they need, then you have no problem. Don't freak out about it. The two that are most common in terms of needing to be addressed are your sulfur and boron, and that is because your sulfur and boron, as well as your nitrogen, are all mobile. And so they will just naturally leach out of your soil, and so they will need to eventually be amended. Whereas the other 4, which are heavy metals, don't necessarily leach. If you want to get rid of them, they need to be uptaken, utilized, and then removed off of the property in the form of a crop. Going back to the bottom and looking at our pH scale, pH is very, very, very significant for us because we are not putting nutrients down to give to our plant. As I mentioned, we are putting nutrients down so our plant can use them. And if you lean one way or the other too aggressively on this pH scale, you're inhibiting the uptake of particular nutrients. Just looking right down there, those iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc at a 7.5 pH are very difficult to uptake. And as we drop down to that 5.5 pH, many of the macronutrients become difficult to uptake. So that's why there's this balance, and that's why you hear most people or most individuals recommending a 6.2 to 6.8 slightly acidic soil. It's just because that is where most nutrients are the most available. All right, so we sent out our test. We looked at everything there was to use, and we started to get into it a little bit. And our soil test has finally arrived, and we need to figure out, what do we attack first? There's all this information here, but I want to figure it out. I gave you a little bit of a teaser, but CEC and pH are the 2 biggest ones, but sometimes looking at your nutrient levels are hard to avoid depending on how the information is displayed. Don't ignore it. We're going to be referencing again, so just glance at it. So let's look over here. This is my soil sample, and I am not our metaphorical farmer. So to be clear, I have put in here, as you can see, we'll get to organic matter, but our organic matter is 9.6 and it is brought down to 3. And in the bottom, you see corn is scratched in rather than vegetables, and we'll be getting to those momentarily. I just wanted to put that out there now to avoid confusion. But going back to our CEC and pH levels, our CEC is 22.2, which is quite high, to be frank. And that's not bad. That just means that I most likely have a very clay-based soil, which I do, and a higher CEC means that I have a lot of nutrient holding capacity. So if I were to put down potassium, or I were to put down any nutrient, and I wanted to increase that base saturation, it's going to take a lot more investment on my end to move that dial than it will be for someone with a low CEC. But in addition to the CEC, we're going to be looking at our pH. And as you can tell, I have a pH of 7.5, which already alludes to me that there's something wonky going on, because that's not normal for this area. And then secondly, I'm going to quickly glance over at these calcium levels or these nutrient levels, and I see that our calcium is considerably high. But with all that, I'm ready to move on and let's see what else there is. So our base saturation in our organic matter, which again is 3%, which is indicated here. And this is a much easier way to see or reinforce the idea that there's an imbalance. That potassium is not in that 3 to 6% range. That magnesium is slightly below that 10 to 15. That 65 to 75% calcium, the example or the soil test here is at 89.6, dang near 90, then your sodium and hydrogen. Hydrogen being 0, referencing our alkaline soil pH, it makes complete sense. So long story short, you guys were already figuring out that there's quite a red flag or two in this soil test that we are going to need to address. But after I've looked at the base saturation in the soil organic matter, I go back and I look at all the macronutrients as well as any ratios that I like to keep in mind. And for this presentation, we're just going to be looking namely at the magnesium and calcium relationship. I like to see 7 or 8 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. And that is because of that antagonistic relationship that I alluded to earlier within Mulder's chart. If you end up having a nutrient such as calcium, like in this example, just dominating the soil, what happens is you create a situation of nutrient lockup, which is going to inhibit other areas of development. But outside of our calcium and magnesium, let's just quickly reference our phosphorus and our potassium. Our potassium is only at 71 parts per million, so that's low already. I can't really bank on our soil giving us a lot of potassium. Whereas our phosphorus is at 140 parts per million. And I guess I would say that I did misspoke when I say that there is no macronutrient parameters. Phosphorus is kind of unique. I like to see that between 75 and 150 parts per million. However, there's a huge amount of fluctuation there, but that within that range is what you're mostly going to see outside of a situation such as like a greenhouse or where there has been aggressive manure applications or compost applications. So not only do I know that we have an imbalance, I know of nutrients here, I see that our ratios are off as well within our calcium and magnesium, and that's going to need to be fixed in a moment, but let's see what else there is. Addressing our micronutrient values, well, less than 20 parts per million of sulfur, more than 4 of zinc, more than 12 of iron, 0.5 to 2 parts per million of copper. Manganese is escaping me right now, but I know it's fine. And our boron is at 2 parts per million, which is actually quite high. And that is mostly due to the fact that I have, or this soil test has such high CEC values. Again, pardon me if I reference this as myself. I was looking at this, planning out my crop calendar over the weekend. And then through all of this, let's look at the crop specific needs. And of course, we're not growing vegetables, we're growing corn. So let's see what that looks like. And then we're going to throw everything together and that's going to create our recommendation. For those of you that do have questions, there will be time for Q&A at the end. Understanding nitrogen fertility. This is something that I've always been curious about my entire time that I've been here in organic agriculture. Is nitrogen credits are such a thing in traditional agriculture, but we don't necessarily discuss them here, which I found to be somewhat odd, only because we work so hard to take care of our soil. So why would we not expect our soil to work for us in a way? Let me break down what I mean. Using our information from the conversation before, we know that our farmer wants 175 bushels to the acre, and each bushel of corn uses 0.9 pounds of nitrogen. So we would need a total of 158 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And I'm dealing with numbers rounded to the nearest complete number. If you do happen to be doing this math along with us, there will be a very small amount of variation, but it will not change the recommendation overall. I also looked at my organic matter credit. Depending on where you're located, you want to look at your local extension agency. Since I'm based here in Pennsylvania, I looked at Penn State's guidelines, and there states that for every 2% or for every 1% organic matter above 2%, you give yourself 20 credits or 20 units of nitrogen credited towards your fertility. Well, we have 3% organic matter, so I'm going to give myself 20 pounds of nitrogen. Manure previous manure application, we applied at 1 ton to the acre. And because of that manure test I had taken, I know that it has 4% organic nitrogen. And that's important because since this is last year's manure, I know that our available nitrogen or our inorganic nitrogen is not going to be there anymore. It's simply what is actively being broken down. But not all of that manure is being broken down now. I mean, it was applied last year, so how much is actually available? And that would be about, for the first year, it's going to be 12%. I said first year after application, you're going to be utilizing about 12% of that residual availability, which is going to be 10% total nitrogen. Afterwards, let's look at what we planted last year. We planted soybeans and we harvested at 40 bushels per acre. And I'm actually only going to credit myself 0.5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. Some individuals will credit more, but since we put a cover crop in, I'm going to assume that half or a large majority of that nitrogen that I put down had been uptaken by that cover crop. So I don't feel like I should warrant an entire credit of nitrogen for my soybean production last year. But speaking of cover crops, in speaking with this farmer, they say that they safely account for 10 pounds of nitrogen to be available through incorporation. So we have 20 pounds from the organic matter, 10 pounds from the last year's manure, 20 pounds from the last year's crop, and 10 pounds from the cover crop, which leads to a total of 60 nitrogen credits. So let's figure out what our nitrogen gap is. Total credits minus, or the total needs minus the credits equal the total remaining, or 98 pounds. And this is where things kind of shift a little bit based on a traditional or conventional operation in comparison to organic. As I mentioned, I have been doing organic fertility recommendations for quite some time, and I had the opportunity to learn from some very experienced individuals that had been doing organic soil recommendations for several decades before. And I'm very thankful for that, because that laid the foundation from which I was able to learn at my time here at Rodale, and safely I can account for about 30% or 1/3 of my crop's needs to be met just through my organic soil management practices. And I'm going to be speaking about that more at length later in this presentation, but for now, let's just take this 0.3. So I take the total pounds of nitrogen that I'm expected to need, multiplying it by 0.3 gives me 47. I expect, because of my organically managed practices, I'm going to be getting an additional 47 units of nitrogen. But that's not all. As it says here on the left side there, reevaluate your cover crop system and your organic matter release. And that's because if we do take those steps and we get that forage test and we look online to see what our total nitrogen is in comparison to our biomass, and then we figure out what we're going to be actually working in because we calculated the total biomass that we have at the time of termination, we're able to actually refine that 10 units that the farmer just assumed is there to something that can be much more plentiful. And 10 units is actually quite a low ball in a lot of situations, but I felt like it was a very good baseline recommendation, especially since this is something that is comparing both traditional and organic practices. And you typically will be working your cover crops in somewhat earlier in a conventional operation than an organic. So I'm just trying to save myself the hassle of doing that quick breakdown. But with all that said, we're going to go with that 10 pounds from the cover crops, even for our organic recommendation. So we have our 60 units that we've already discussed, plus the 47 we have here, gives you 51 units of nitrogen still needed for that plant, which is quite digestible, even for an organic farmer. And of course, we have our phosphorus and our potassium fertility as well, and that one isn't nearly as complex. It's simply the expected bushels, or the ideal amount of bushels, multiplied by the nutrient uptake per bushel, and I have the math right here. For your phosphorus, I'm going to be saying 65 pounds per acre, and for your potassium, I'm going to be saying 48, just for simplicity's sake. So now we're here. Step 4, we're almost done, and we are just getting into the actual recommendation. So let's just break this down piece by piece, just like when we first started looking at it. So let's look at the CEC, pH, and nutrient levels. And we already, as discussed, know that we have a high pH and we have high calcium levels. So what's going to be our plan of action? It's going to be to apply sulfur. And I'll be explaining the reason behind all of this in a moment. Now let's go to your base saturation and your organic matter percent, which is 3%. I see that my calcium and magnesium are low, and I'm going to need to be addressing that, most likely moving forward for the next several growing seasons due to the deficiency. Your macronutrient values and ratios, as discussed, we can clearly see that our calcium magnesium ratio is off. So I'm going to need to get some additional magnesium in there, while ideally having calcium be uptaken more effectively. You have your micronutrient levels, where the only thing that is an issue is going to be my sulfur level, or the farmer's sulfur level. And that's very common. You're either going to have low sulfur levels, low boron levels, both, or you're most likely in some type of situation where there is no potential for runoff, such as a greenhouse, because nutrient buildup is very common. And then lastly is going to be your crop specific needs. And we just did that math. We need 51 or 98 to 65, or 51 to 98 pounds of nitrogen, 65 pounds of phosphorus, and 48 pounds of potassium. How do we figure that out though? Well, now that all the math is pretty much done, it's quite simple. I have it broken down in 3 ways, because I personally feel like it doesn't matter if you're conventional or organic or just a sustainable farmer. Like, whoever you are, you're going to be applying manure if you have it. So let's look at your manure application, and then we're going to differentiate the 2 systems. So with this manure application, as stated, I know we have our dairy manure available. That is a 646, 2% inorganic, 4% organic nitrogen. And various studies, Penn State, Cornell, both kind of reached the general consensus, or it's an accepted fact, pardon me, that about 50% of the total nitrogen that you apply in a manure application is going to be utilized in that first year. So we're going in at 10 tons to the acre, and that is going to yield us 60 pounds of nitrogen total, but it's going to yield us this growing season 30 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, and 60 pounds of potassium. That means after our manure application, we're going to be needing 21 to 68 pounds of nitrogen, 25 pounds of phosphorus, and we actually will be having a surplus in terms of our crop needs. We are exceeding it by 12 pounds. So we are still going to want to be addressing some of these concerns, but it doesn't mean that we're going to be needing it specifically for a crop. We have our traditional recommendation, and full transparency, I am by no means a conventional agronomist, and this can be changed, and there are a lot of nuances that can be done to it. But for this example, we need 68 units of nitrogen, 25 pounds of phosphorus. So we're just going to be applying some diammonium phosphate and ammonium nitrate at the respected amounts in order to be getting the designated nitrogen and phosphorus requirements. Organically, we want to look at this season and beyond. Right now, we have, in terms of our micronutrients, a deficit of 21 pounds of nitrogen. There are 25 pounds of phosphorus. But at 140 pounds of phosphorus in the soil, I would not be concerned about not having enough available phosphorus, because we are within our acceptable range. If we wanted to incorporate additional phosphorus, or if the farmer really wanted to try and bump that up, we could easily do so by either increasing the manure application or looking at another input such as rock phosphate. But outside of the phosphorus discussion and the nitrogen needs, we need to look at our micronutrient values as well. We know our magnesium and we know our sulfur are low, and so now we're just going to hop straight into looking at our inputs. Well, feather meal is both a rapid release and a slow release fertilizer. The blood in the feather is available right away, and then the actual feather itself will break down later on in the season. Whereas peanut meal is not necessarily the fastest, but it does break down substantially quicker than the remaining aspect of the feather meal. And if we were to do 100 pounds of each right there, we are at our 21 units of nitrogen. And also, in terms of tackling all our other concerns, our magnesium, our sulfur, and then increasing our potassium as well, sulfate of magnesia potash is able to address all three of those concerns. So just with those three inputs, coupled with all of the practices that we have to follow, choose to follow, because we believe that our soils are what is steering our success, we're able to create a fairly digestible and by no means economically unfeasible recommendation. And there still are concerns that are going to need to be addressed. Our high pH and our high calcium will take several growing seasons, as mentioned, to actually break down. And our soil potassium levels are going to take some time to build up. This is a marathon, not a sprint. We cannot afford, because we do not have the resources to try and sprint through and get a lot of this fertility up into our plants. We need to have that laying there available for our plants right away. So I want to go back and I want to look at our resources here. Now that we've been through everything and we can kind of see the significance, soil testing is a great baseline when you're looking at your fertility. It's going to give you that chemical portfolio. Your manure and your compost tests are going to show you the fertility of what your input is. Your carbon to nitrogen ratio of your cover crop is going to let you know the degradation rate of your cover crop when incorporated, so you will have an understanding of how quickly that fertility will be made available to your crop. And as we get closer to the season, we get our forage tests and we look at our stand and evaluate how large it is and how much we could expect per tonnage weight, or however the information is displayed by our various extensions or resources here. With all of that, we've essentially done the math to calculate an input that we've already applied. We just needed to do the math to see how useful it is. All of that comes together. But I want to talk a little bit more, because I've mentioned cover crops and carbon to nitrogen ratio several times. I wanted to just really quickly give you a breakdown of what that may look like here. There is obviously on the left side, there is a list or category that categorizes the C to N ratio of your cover crops here. And I want everyone to have a particular carbon to nitrogen ratio in mind, and that is 24:1. That 24:1 ratio is a carbon to nitrogen ratio of essentially your soil microbes. And that is enough for them to maintain as well as digest and survive and thrive. Essentially, you need 24 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And if you start to teeter off that, and it does not have to be exact, but when you start to teeter off of that, what happens is, should you go too low with hairy vetch, if you were to run into a situation where you wanted to create a lot of long-term nitrogen, pardon me, you're going to be struggling with that, because the soil biome is going to break that down as quickly as possible, and it's not going to have to try very hard. There's not a lot of fibrous development in that hairy vetch. So you could be creating a large blossom of fertility that may not stay around long. Or it could be the other way around, and you're looking at incorporating some rye at anthesis, and that rye is going to take a little bit of time to actually get chewed up and worked into the soil to start yielding you nutrients. If you go too far, or it takes too long and you have too much carbon in your soil, what happens is a two-step process. One is nitrogen immobilization, where as your soil biome creates nitrogen from breaking down this carbon, it's instantly consuming it. So your plants are never able to utilize it. The second thing that happens is, should it continue to happen or the problem exacerbates, you will actually run into nitrogen mineralization, where your soil microbes will die off, which isn't bad when done in a healthy way or a consistent way. But if you run into a situation where you're just locking yourself out of nutrients, that's not good. Your plants, your microbes are just dying off, and nothing is able to be there to utilize and capture that nitrogen, versus a healthy soil biome where you have that natural death of those soil microbes. It's just another form of nutrient cycling, but it's a form of nutrient cycling that's able to hold on to that fertility for a long period of time, or a longer period of time than many other means. So when I talk to a farmer and we're looking at our cover crops, I want to know the types, the rates, the method, the time of the application, the time that you are planning to work it down, any inputs that you plan on incorporating with it, and then should you choose to take those additional steps, get the carbon to nitrogen ratio as well as the biomass and forage testing. Now, here's kind of where things get interesting to me, is you have to ask yourself why is there this different approach, and why isn't it something that is just out everywhere? Well, it's very much because organic agriculture is a system in which we are banking on a lot of our assumptions working, and they do. And that's why we're able to succeed, and that's why we're able to continue to see this growth year after year in this industry. We prioritize soil health above a lot of other aspects, and I am not insinuating that conventional farmers don't. Some of the best conservationists I know are conventional farmers, but when you use inputs that can be damaging to your soil, there is a limit to the rate at which you are able to build up that population. And conventional fertilizers are shown to not necessarily be the most encouraging in terms of microbial soil health development. So we use less damaging inputs, not because we choose to, or some because we choose to, but also because we're limited in them for those of us that are certified organic. We have a faster nutrient uptake as well for the inputs that we utilize, because what we are hoping for is that the soil is able to become efficient to the point where it's able to expedite the nutrient or the input breakdown, nutrient synthesization and utilization within our fields. We have reduced to no leaching of nutrients as well, depending on the source. We have to deal with a shorter growing season because we are more limited in what we're able to use. We cannot have a plant grow as quickly or as aggressively as a traditional farmer. So we have to wait until the natural conditions become more hospitable for the crop we are trying to grow. And we're doing all of this and not giving ourselves any credit for it. Someone that taught me, once said that organic agriculture is a faith-based system, which I agree with. And we, to this day, do not have the tools needed to accurately quantify and measure the abundancy and efficiency in which our soil health is able to do everything that we're asking it to do. But at the same time, we keep following principles that encourage the development of this healthy ecosystem. So when you do a recommendation, you need to take in those principles as well. And there is no way to really quantify it. And so that 0.3 that I multiply the nitrogen needs by was something that I learned along the way from individuals that have been doing this longer than I had been alive. The research is not out there to prove it. We're getting closer and closer year by year, and I look forward to what this industry has ahead of us. But for now, we don't. And so we need some type of bench line to do so. And that's where that 0.3 comes into play. We have reverse volatilization argument if you want. When you're looking at a traditional input, you need to increase the total nitrogen product applied because of volatilization. Well, we don't have that. We actually have like nutrient holding. So we just kind of take the same math and turn it in our favor. And it's been working out. I've seen it do that for years. And all of that struggle creates a more profitable system that we have to invest in less and less year after year. And we are able to be given a value-added product for it. And that's pretty much it. I mean, that was a whole lot of something for a very brief, not nothing, but a very brief discussion about how we are able to utilize or understand how these practices can work for us or work in advantage, or we can take advantage of these practices, I should say. Open up the floor to any questions that anyone may have. And I see here that the first question is, what does CEC stand for? And I'll actually hop back to that. CEC stands for cation exchange capacity. Cation exchange capacity is, imagine you had a small cube of soil in front of you, a 1x1 cube of soil. There are 22.2 spots in this zoomed in perspective of your soil. There are 22.2 spots where it is essentially possible for nutrient exchange to happen between the soil and your plant. So cation exchange capacity, or CEC, is a representation of your soil's nutrient holding capacity. Can you please explain how excess calcium interferes with nutrient uptake? Yeah, I absolutely can. So calcium, what happens is calcium is a cation, and it is essentially referred to as the vehicle that drives the nutrients into the plant so they can be utilized. That's why it's so important, is it's needed for that nutrient uptake. But what happens is when you have excess calcium, those cations kind of bond with one another and they become insoluble. You don't want calcium to bond with calcium. You want calcium to bond with anions within your soil, or nutrients within your soil, and that creates a soluble nutrient for your plant. I mean, I'm generalizing this, but this is how it works. And so when your calcium gets too high, that abundancy of calcium creates an environment in which a cation will bond with another cation. And when that happens, it's hard. It's more difficult to separate them than it is with other nutrients. Could I please repeat the normal range for CEC values? So I don't really give normal CEC values, because a CEC value is simply what you have in your soil. It's a fairly substantial undertaking in order to change the CEC that you have. So I don't tell people, oh, well, your CEC is too high, it's 22.2. We need to lower that to like a 10 to 15. That's nonsensical. And on the other perspective, if it's 5 to 7, I don't tell someone that they need to increase it. I simply say, hey, so this is what your soils look like. This is how we need to move forward, whether that be splitting up fertility applications so we don't overload the soil and risk leaching, or we go in moving forward with the understanding that we are going to have small amounts of nutrient buildup over time. If I have low phosphate, low potash, low calcium, but high magnesium, how should I approach balancing the soil? So you're always going to want to look at calcium before pretty much everything else. Calcium is definitely one of the top 3. I encourage organic matter, pH, and calcium to be like the first 3 things that we want to look into addressing. If you are having high magnesium, chances are that you actually may have more nutrition available than you think, especially like in terms of potassium. But magnesium, when it reaches a certain threshold within your soil, and everyone's is different, you're getting that nutrient lockup. I would say apply some lime, just like straight high calcium lime, and then look at using some type of compost or manure that's going to get you your macronutrients. And right there, just with those 2 inputs, you're tackling your low phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. How much does soil testing cost? It fluctuates, but I tell people around $20. Some outlets will do it for free. The cost shouldn't dissuade people, but what you should look into when having a test taken is making sure all of the information that we have spoken about today in this presentation is displayed on the soil test. Sometimes you have to ask for extras, and sometimes you will need to look at a completely different method. Isn't it possible to increase the low CEC by adding organic matter? Absolutely, 100% it is. And that's part of the conversation of increasing organic matter, which in turn can increase CEC to a degree. But when I look at increasing organic matter, I do so because it will benefit the soil health. It will not change the CEC. But you are absolutely right, Delia. Increasing your You can increase a low CEC soil by increasing organic matter. Basic question for taking soil samples: is using a probe, if available, a better option than the shovel method? Honestly, if you have a probe, it just makes quicker work because you can go in, you can stick the probe in a clear spot of dirt, you can take it out, bang it on the side of your bucket, and then move on with your life. One is not better than the other. It's just I like the probe because I can get in, get my sample, and get out much quicker than if I have to dig up the sample. How do no-till farmers incorporate additives into the soil? That is a really good question. And that could spawn an entirely different conversation in and of itself. What a no-till farmer generally does is, if they are true 100% no-till, then they are mostly going to prioritize using cover crops to capture and retain nutrients for the following crop. Some no-till farmers, though, will do conservative tillage practices, as that is something that is becoming the idea of it is becoming more and more sound as we get more research about the damage that tillage can cause to a soil microbial biome or the soil health. And the general consensus is, as long as your soil is healthy and you minimize tillage and you use it responsibly, some forms of tillage or annual tillage done responsibly is not going to be damaging to your soil to the degree that we may have previously thought. Because if no-till farmers do not incorporate their products in some way, shape, or form, what can happen is stratification. And stratification is simply the situation or the scenario when a lot of your nutrition is stuck in that, first top 2 inches of the soil, when, your root mass is 6 to 8 inches and to several feet down into the soil, depending on what your crops are. Does anyone else happen to have any questions? So Zoe had asked, how long after adding soil modifying additives should I retest my soil to see if further changes are needed? I encourage everyone to just take a soil test annually. Doing anything beyond that isn't bad. It's just not necessarily needed because your fertility program has already been taken care of. If you're growing vegetables, the plastic's already laid. You're not doing much beyond that. If it's a row crop situation, chances are your crop's already in the ground. So taking it once a year and just adjusting it growing season by growing season is the most realistic way of tackling these problems. Greg, you had asked, do the recommendations discussed today apply to coastal tropical soils? Really good question, and kind of. The reason I say kind of is depending on where your soils are and their CEC and nutrient holding capacity, sometimes some of those parameters or those benchmarks are really hard to get, especially when it comes to like some of those more mobile nutrients like your sulfur and your boron. I'm not saying that they are completely useless, but generally if you're in a very light CEC area or sandy soiled area, getting a soil test is going to be a better indication of your health than just operating on these guidelines for sure. All right. Well, I think that is it, everyone. I thank you much for attending. And I just wanted to let everyone know that should you have any questions, comments, or concerns, here's my information as well. Feel free to shoot me an email. Let me know how terribly I did. I'm quick to cry. Or if you had any indication that you may want to continue these conversations further and see what advantages there are to take advantage of, I guess, at Rodale Consulting, please feel free to reach out to them as well. And depending on where you are, it can be a service that is able to be compensated. Like if you're based in Pennsylvania, our services are free for now. And I'm very happy for that to be able to be the case. Definitely keep in mind that webinars do happen every week, so look on our website as well to see if there's anything else that might interest you. And if you are local or you're just wanting to come and tour our main campus in Kutztown, we're doing an open house on July 21st. It's $25 to attend. Myself and many of the consultants and everyone at Rodale is going to be there. So please feel free to stop by, chat us up, and just enjoy yourselves right here. And then just real quick, lastly, would you repeat the range you'd like for phosphorus? It is 75 to 150 parts per million. Anyways, everyone, I thank you again for attending this conversation or this presentation, and I hope it does open up a discussion that can be had. Feel free to reach out. Thank you much.